Hello and welcome to the last of 6 presentations in the Global Motivations Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. The global rebalance of power continues. The ambitions, alliances, and actions of world powers have accelerated shifts in the international order that was framed in the waning days of the Second World War. What interests countries on the world stage today? What outcomes do they seek? And what role do cooperation and competition play? In this 6-part virtual series, we've been painting a portrait of 6 world powers, their internal and external drivers, their evolving role in the community of nations, and what this means for the rest of the world. We hope you'll engage with us today as we explore the motivations of China. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. We're grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program and the Global Motivations Lecture Series possible. In particular, thanks to sustaining series sponsors Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White and the University of St. Mary, and supporting series sponsor Burns and McDonnell. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. We're also very glad for the support of the U.S. Heartland China Association, an IRC organizational member in planning this program. Here to share a few words about the association is Executive Director Min Fan. Min?
Thank you, Matthew. It's always such an honor to collaborate on a project around China. And as our chairman, former Governor Missouri Bob Holden, who's watching right now, always tells me it is local community organization like yours that make a difference. So we're truly honored. And at the U.S. Heartland China Association, we believe the U.S.-China relationship is the most consequential bilateral relationship of our time. If we're going to have any chance confronting climate change, pandemic prevention, food security, we really need to find a way for U.S. and China to work together. So this conversation is very necessary and timely. Thank you so much, and looking forward to learn from our excellent speaker today.
Min, thank you so much, and thanks for all the work that you and your team do around our region. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Dr. Jack Zhang is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Kansas, an IRC organizational member, and Director of the KU Trade War Lab. He's a 2021-22 Wilson China Fellow. His research explores the political economy of trade and conflict in East Asia. He was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton University and has been the recipient of various grants and awards, including the Fulbright U.S. Student Grant and the Minerva Research Initiative University Research Grant. Jack, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Matthew, and thanks also to the IRC and the U.S. Heartland China Association for the opportunity to be part of this conversation to close out this fantastic Global Motivation series. Thank you also to everyone who's joining us live today. And before I start, I want to make a quick plug for an event that IRC is co-sponsoring with the KU Center for East Asian Studies next week, our local China Town Hall event next Wednesday on 11/16 starting at 6 p.m. on the legacy of COVID-19 on U.S.-China relations. Hopefully Amy doesn't mind that I make that introduction, that this is a National Committee of U.S.-China Relations event where Amy is a member of that board. And we're really excited to here at KU to work with the IRC to make that event possible. So maybe we can you can find the information on the IRC website, and maybe we can drop it also in the chat for folks. But without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Amy Celico virtually to Kansas City. Amy is a principal at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a pioneering global strategic advisory and commercial diplomacy firm, and she's the co-leader of the firm's China practice. She's a graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS and has worked as Senior Director for China Affairs at the U.S. Office of U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR. She's also worked in various other roles in government on China policy, including at the Department of State and the Department of Commerce. Earlier in her career, she's a fluent Mandarin speaker and has spent over 7 years living and working in China. I can think of few people better qualified to give us an overview of the internal and external drivers behind China's behavior and the balance of competition and cooperation in China's relationship with its neighbors and the United States. So now I'll turn over the spotlight to Amy to give us some opening remarks to frame these big questions for us. And I look forward to our conversation today. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Professor Zhang. I too am very grateful to IRC and to the U.S. China Heartland Association, organizations that are so important as our countries are trying very hard to manage an increasingly competitive relationship between the U.S. and China, facilitating understanding of what are the motivations of great powers like China, like the United States, and the other 4 countries that you've covered in this series is a difficult topic to cover in just an hour per country, but I'm happy to dive right in on China. I come to this, as you heard from Professor Zhang, with a perspective that's been shaped by watching China change and grow over the past 30 plus years since I first started studying Chinese history and language in the mid-1980s, and had the privilege of working for the US government stationed in Shanghai at our consulate in Shanghai when China was acceding to the World Trade Organization. And my role as an economic officer at the time was helping Chinese local institutions in Zhejiang and Jiangsu, Shanghai, Anhui province come into compliance with those WTO commitments. It was a very exciting time for the US and for China as we were thinking about China's integration into the global economic system governed by the WTO. Let's fast forward to today, where we have a more dysfunctional WTO, where China is the 2nd largest economy in the world. What is motivating China today? Well, I think clearly the Chinese government wants to continue its rise and rejuvenation as a great power. I mean, those are the explicit goals of the Communist Party of China, which runs the Chinese government today. And I think those are legitimate and good aspirations for any country, and China included. And so I think the Chinese government today is very motivated by concerns over its own fragility, whether it's domestic issues around its economy, whether it's around anti-corruption efforts to try to clean up government stakeholders' behavior across China. That was a real drive by President Xi Jinping when he started his first term in office 10 years ago. And he just this past month began his 3rd 5-year term in office. Unprecedented for a modern leader of China to stay in office for 3 terms as head of the Communist Party, which will translate to being him serving as president of China when the government meets next March. And so I think as we talk about China's motivations, we need to acknowledge that those motivations are very much shaped by the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, who has consolidated power in a way that we haven't seen in China's more collective leadership in the modern Chinese era that I'm talking about since the mid-1980s. Xi Jinping is a different leader. He wants to drive policies from the very top And as we saw at the very important Party Congress meeting that happened in October, President Xi stacked the top leadership of the Communist Party with individuals who had worked for him and so have their loyalty to him, rather than this traditional model of a collective leadership where there are different factions having their individuals represented at the top of the Communist Party. And so what we are seeing is Xi Jinping wanting instead to be sure that he is putting forth the leading direction of the government and all of its policies. That consolidation of power was impressive to view from the outside, and brings, of course, probably a lot of stability to China going forward. It also brings some, I think, uncertainty, because if something goes wrong in China starting this fall and for the next 5 years, there will be few to blame who are not directly associated with President Xi and the direction that he personally has put on the Chinese government's motivations. And so that does bring with it some vulnerabilities. But what did President Xi talk about as far as his motivations for his third term in office? I think on the one hand, he was rightly congratulatory of the great progress that China has made under his leadership for the past 10 years. Again, its economy continuing to grow, China's power being projected on the global stage, and also China's handling of COVID-19. A global pandemic that's cost millions of lives, and that is a different story in China, where the death toll has been much, much, much lower, and it's a point of rightful pride by the Chinese government. However, it's also a point of vulnerability for the Chinese economic system, because the means that the Chinese government has used to contain COVID is to stop its spread by locking down areas of China. This dynamic zero COVID policy has had some pretty significant costs to the Chinese economy. And so these are issues managing the impact of the COVID policies is going to be something that is going to dominate domestic policymaking in 2023. Another issue that is going to dominate in 2023 and beyond is how Xi Jinping characterized the external environment that China faces. 5 years ago, when Xi Jinping was starting his second term in office, he characterized the external environment as one that was full of opportunities for China. Some risks, of course, but because of changes on the global stage, Xi Jinping said that China had a moment of strategic opportunity to continue to expand its influence on the global stage in a positive way for China and a positive way for the world. Fast forward 5 years, and what we heard from President Xi last week was China's concerns about the external environment causing a lot of headwinds for China, and that in fact there were many issues in the external environment that could make it more difficult for China to meet its own goals of continued development and rejuvenation. And while the United States was not mentioned by name by President Xi during the Party Congress, clearly he was talking about some of the challenges that China faces on the global stage due to a more competitive US-China relationship, and due to first a Trump administration that started a trade war that has been continued in a Biden administration, and in the Biden administration, an increasing focus on not pursuing competition with China in a vacuum, but bringing other countries, allies, partners, into discussions about dealing with the challenges of US-China competition on the global stage. And that certainly is an issue that President Xi views as a negative development in the global order, and is something that China needs to overcome as it continues to pursue its global motivations. And so both internally, very difficult economic issues that China faces. It's not all just because of COVID-19 policies. We've seen a slowing economy in China, and we've seen, of course, the property market go into crisis in China. And now, most recently, we're seeing China's export-driven growth being impacted by a global economy that also is slowing. And so the Chinese government needs to double down in 2023 on domestic consumption-driven growth. It could try to invest its way out of a slowing economy, but that will be more and more challenging given the very significant debt overhang that China has. On the international stage, of course, Xi Jinping already has been welcoming world leaders. The Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of, or the Party Secretary of Vietnam, have both already visited China since the Party Congress, and more visits are to come. And so President Xi understands that domestically, there's going to be a lot of focus in order for China to continue to meet the aspirations that the Communist Party has set for China's rejuvenation and continued growth as a global power. On the external front, China needs to reinvigorate partnerships and ensure that global stakeholders see the value in China's role on the global stage. Some of that value is being called into question by some other countries. And so the Chinese government needs to be speaking very clearly about, one, its continued openness to foreign investment, and two, the motivations that drive China on the global stage, which are good for global development. And so, those are difficult priorities domestically, righting the economy now that Xi Jinping has consolidated power over the Communist Party and over the government of China. And then on the external front, needing very much to sell the value of China's participation on the global stage, something that China has effectively done in parts of the world, but coming out of recent challenges has also called into question some of China's more assertive and aggressive policies, whether it's at the China-India border, in the South China Sea, over Taiwan. I'm sure a question that will come up in the Q&A, as well as China's continued Belt and Road Initiative investments and the value of economic and soft power that China is certainly trying to build up on the global stage. And so Xi Jinping has his work cut out for him, starting out his third 5-year term. And I do think when he wakes up in the morning, he's not thinking about US-China relations as the top concern that he has. His top concerns really are about the governance of China, China's ability to meet the lofty goals that the Communist Party has set for China's continued growth and rejuvenation as a great global power, and also its role on the global stage being seen as a positive one, where China does want to be not just a taker of global rules, but a shaper of global rules and norms. And that requires the cooperation of the global community to see China in that light, something that the Chinese government has, again, made a lot of progress toward since, for example, it joined the World Trade Organization. But in 2023 and beyond, we know the views towards globalization have changed significantly. There are more pulls towards protectionism here in the United States. In China, a bigger focus on self-reliance and self-sufficiency, and in other parts of the world. And so grappling with those challenges is going to make for a very, very busy agenda for President Xi at home and abroad. And US-China relations and how that relationship continues to grow is something we'll all need to be watching very closely. President Xi and President Biden should be meeting on the sidelines of the G20 next week. And I'm going to be listening to hear if the two leaders, two men who have known one another for more than the past decade, since they were both vice presidents together and now heads of state, how they are going to manage this increasingly competitive relationship between the US and China. We can't go back to characterizing the relationship as one of predominantly positive cooperation, but we can't also fast forward to a relationship that must be contentious, that must lead to war. We have to manage the two largest economies of the world, the two biggest powers on the world stage today, having a relationship that is able to withstand the pressure of competition without having it veer into confrontation over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over differences in ideology, human rights, over views towards the war in Ukraine. None of this can allow the relationship between the US and China to turn into one driven by enmity. It must be one that acknowledges the competition and the disagreements that characterize many areas of the relationship. It also has to be a relationship that acknowledges the need for cooperation between the United States and China on so many global issues that will help China meet its global goals, whether we're talking about climate change or we're talking about the next global health pandemic or we're talking about non-proliferation goals. Or if we're talking about American interests, many of them overlapping when it comes to climate change and non-proliferation and meeting the goals and aspirations of American citizens. This isn't going to be easy, but I think Xi Jinping feels like at the Party Congress, he has consolidated power, and we're waiting to see who are the political and economic leaders in government positions, and we'll see that over the coming months, who will be taking the reins of the US-China relationship after, hopefully, President Biden and President Xi meet next week and say, let's try to manage this competition in a more constructive way. Let me leave it there, Jack, and see what questions you have for me and this audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy, for these insights. I think you gave us a fantastic overview of China's motivations, these lofty expectations in some ways, and then the challenges coming both from internally and externally, for presidency over the next 5 years. So I encourage the audience to type in your questions in the Q&A. I'll do my best to curate them and maybe synthesize them into our conversation here. But I'd like to start with a question about the trade war, the tech war, which you mentioned in your presentation, right? Not so much in the headlines here in the US anymore, but the USTR is doing a necessity review, right? I wanted to ask you, as we're moving into this phase, who's winning, right? The Biden administration continuing this policy. Who's winning? How do we know? How much longer is it going to go on, and how does it end?
Well, this is my deeply held personal view. There are no winners in a trade war. It is bad for just about every stakeholder, unfortunately. But let me back up and unpack your question, because it's such an important one. The trade war was begun for a reason, and the reason was to try to motivate the Chinese government to change policies that the last administration viewed were unfair. And I'll hasten to add, this is a bipartisan issue, because the Biden administration, as you already mentioned, has continued these same policies. None of the tariffs that were the hammer meant to try to pressure China to change its behavior have been lifted. None of the retaliatory tariffs that China then placed on our exports to China have been lifted either. I mean, this is really, that's right, a war. It is a disagreement over what the US perceives as Chinese unfair trade practices, the use of subsidies, the abuse of intellectual property rights. And again, the reason that I say there's no winner in a trade war is because, in my opinion, Of course, the application of tariffs only hurts consumers in the United States and in China, who end up paying the cost of those tariffs. But again, the motivation was to change what was characterized as unfair practices by the Chinese government. And USTR did do research into this, did an investigation, and found that the behavior of the Chinese government had cost the U.S. economy in terms of the use of subsidies, undermining American competitors, and of course the abuse of intellectual property, forced technology transfer costs to American business stakeholders. The reason why I think we are not seeing an end to the trade war, and instead, as you mentioned, Jack, we've seen an expansion. Now technology is at the forefront of US-China competition, and there are a series of actions being taken by Washington and by Beijing in some ways to decouple parts of the economic interdependence that have built up between the US and China. And that is, again, because of accusations of our national interests being undermined by these behaviors. The US accuses China of. China also very, very concerned about US use of access to Chinese, for example, user data, how it can be misused by American stakeholders, potentially the US government. So what I'm focused on here is this bleeding of national security-based issues into the economic relationship. Whether it's US-China commercial ties on a whole range of products and services, or it's US-China technology investments as well as trade now being restricted because of some national security-based concerns. And unfortunately, while I don't see a winner there, I do see a continuation of that policy. We just saw, of course, the US release its national security strategy. And I think one part of that document that's important for all of us in understanding how the US is looking at China's motivations, the US government, is the fact that the national security strategy reads that over the next 10 years, there's going to be so much technological innovation that if the United States doesn't maintain its lead in this technological competition between the US and China, it could permanently undermine American national interests and national security interests, national economic interests. And so the national security strategy laid out in pretty clear terms the motivations of the US government, not only to enhance our own innovation ecosystem, to protect ourselves in maintaining a technology lead, but in some ways to ensure that China doesn't have the ability to surpass us in some of this technological innovation. And the link that was drawn by the national security strategy was because of Chinese, this term, civil military fusion, civilian technologies can then be transferred to the military and used for national security-based aims that could put American national security in jeopardy. And so you're absolutely right, Jack. This is the tip of the spear now to US-China technology competition. Again, a competition that won't just be bilateral. The United States, after releasing a very substantial package of export controls last month, has been working with other stakeholders to make them plurilateral, have not just them be US export controls, but Japan and Europe, potentially South Korea also participate in this. The Chinese government naturally sees that as constraining their ability to grow. And so they too are taking action to reduce the vulnerability to restrictions being placed on the Chinese economy by US policy. And so again, reinforce indigenous innovation and reduce reliance on American technology. So this competition is going to really define some elements of US-China relations, absolutely, for the next decade.
Thank you. I agree with you wholeheartedly on both the lacking, trade wars not producing winners, and also on this simultaneously the securitization, right, of trade from what used to be a ballast in the bilateral relationship to now one of the most contentious sort of dimensions. And to weave in an audience question and maybe, expand this conversation a little bit, right? Is the U.S. provoking China to act more aggressively with policies like, for example, export controls that will kneecap sort of the Chinese semiconductor industry, or actions like Taiwan and supplying with more advanced weapons? What is your sort of take on this security dilemma type of action-reaction dynamic?
Yeah, unfortunately, it fits into the characterization of a security dilemma where the action-reaction dynamic is actually escalating tensions rather than reducing them. And so I appreciate the questioner, the gist of that question being, why is the United States doing this? It's actually increasing pressures on the relationship and potentially competition leading to confrontation. And I'll just hasten to add that same question is being asked by many US government officials about Chinese policies, that a lot of Chinese actions, rhetoric, are not reducing the areas of competition and disagreement between the United States and China, but instead increasing them. And I guess one area would be, we can come back to Taiwan. It's a very thorny issue and the most contentious one. But let me add another one first, and that is Russia's war in Ukraine. And the fact that the United States and China couldn't come to some kind of consensus on that conflict that is having a devastating impact in terms of human life, economic costs, global food and energy security issues, despite all of us seeing the terrible ramifications of that war. There hasn't been a lot of active cooperation between the United States and China, and that's a great failure of both governments, that we couldn't come together like we have in the past. For example, when the global financial crisis happened, I think the US and China were able to coordinate and collaborate over that. It was, the genesis of the G20. And I think when G20 leaders meet next week, there is going to be a fundamental question of why can't the international community come together in a more constructive way just to stop what is happening in Ukraine. And of course, one of the reasons is because we characterize the conflict there very, very differently. And so, to the questioner, I do agree that the United States is taking provocative actions on the economic front, rather than trying to cooperate with China as we traditionally have tried to do on the economic front. Instead, in some ways, furthering some limited, not whole scale, but limited decoupling. But I will say, I think both governments are taking actions that are limiting interdependence because of the vulnerabilities that both economies face because of the interdependence. And unfortunately, in this current environment, I don't see that dynamic really changing.
Yeah. Would you like to take on the Taiwan question now, or we can circle back to it maybe?
I'm happy to. This is a really challenging question, because everybody who looks at the issue of Taiwan has baked in some preconceived notions about it. And so I'll try to think about it in terms of this triangle of stakeholders. Of course, Washington being the outsider in the triangle, the other two being Taipei and Beijing. And so this is a Chinese issue, absolutely. And the United States government continues to reiterate that it adheres to a one China policy, and calls on the actors involved, and those are the stakeholders in Beijing and Taipei, to resolve the issue of one China peacefully. And again, this classic security dilemma where stakeholders in Taiwan and the United States feel that stakeholders in mainland China are taking actions that are forcing them to change their behavior, whether it is calls for more separation from China. I won't say independence, nobody talks that way, but talking about Taiwan being able to have more of a voice in international organizations as a non-state actor, and the United States saying, given concerns about Chinese more provocative military behavior in the Taiwan Strait, the United States should reinforce Taiwan security, as we always have, given that it's legislated into our China policy, the Taiwan Relations Act. But Beijing very rightly would point to developments like the Taiwan Policy Act, which is under consideration in Congress. And I need to stress that it is not US policy, it is not a US law, but consideration of enhancing the way that the United States treats Taiwan as a quote unquote non-NATO ally in ways that Beijing says doesn't adhere to the one China policy that the United States has committed to follow. And so again, I truly feel that every actor in this triangle is taking actions that they legitimately feel is in reaction to a provocation by one or two of the others. This is very destabilizing, not just because this is going to continue to ratchet up tensions, but because of the concern over the possibility of an accident happening as all of this provocation is taking place that involves military exercises in the region. And so, you know, I was living in Shanghai when the EP3 incident happened, when a Chinese military jet ran into a US surveillance aircraft, and resulting in the death of the Chinese pilot and the emergency landing of that US military plane on Hainan Island. And again, I was a diplomat in Shanghai watching from there as first, all of the crew members were, of course, allowed to leave China, and second, the plane was allowed to be taken off of Hainan and returned to the United States. That was a level of cooperation and an ability to take a crisis and, rather than escalate it, find a way to resolve the crisis and de-escalate tensions in a very constructive way. And it was, of course, much easier to do because the US and China had many mechanisms for regular communication and had a motivation to de-escalate. That kind of accident happening today, I still believe that our leaders don't want a war. And so I think every effort would be made to not have a war, but we just don't have those channels of communication in place to ensure that a crisis wouldn't escalate and really spin out of control. And that is, to me, one of the most worrying elements of all that is around the Taiwan question.
Thank you. Yeah, very troubling, and yeah, no more SNED. I know you worked on as part of those dialogues, and then so the ways to coordinate have fractured since relations have taken this turn. I want to stay on the US-China relationship a little bit and then broaden it out to sort of a more global perspective. And I want to bring in an insight that you had earlier, which is, right, the US national security strategy sees a time window, right? Time is limited to achieve, or maybe an opportunity will be lost after this window. China, interestingly, also sees, I think, people talk about these, goals and deadlines for national rejuvenation, right? And there are these concerns about, power transition at the same time. So, one is sort of how should we take these timelines sort of seriously, and how are they going to contribute to, potentially making crises more acute or not? But wrapped into this question, I also wanted to ask you something about growth, right? So as you mentioned in your presentation, Chinese economic growth has slowed down dramatically this year due to, zero COVID and other things, below 3% maybe, right? And that's at about the same rate that the US is growing. Chinese economy, $18 trillion, short of 18 trillion, is still well behind the US at 24 trillion. I think maybe even 2 years ago, people would expect that gap to eventually close within that 10-year gap. Now it's an open question, right? And that gap is huge, right? The $6 trillion there, that's like an entire Japanese economy. That's, that's the third largest economy in the world. It's a big gap, right? And so how does that play into, right? These expectations about trajectories of growth play into these timelines that both governments are thinking with? Is that going to exacerbate these crisis dynamics? And it's like, we better go now than ever, when the gap is even bigger? Or is it going to, are we going to get over sort of this moment of crisis and broaden sort of the time horizons?
Such a great question. And I wish I had some data to put behind my view of how things could move forward. I have to say, I anticipate that in order for China to lessen that gap, they have to have a more stable international environment. China can't afford to be fighting a war or continuing to decouple from the largest economy in the world and expect to meet its goals. And I think when the goals were set, and were more achievable, and we'll just look back to the World Bank report of China overcoming this middle country income trap, that of course there was the possibility originally years ago for China by the end of this decade to overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world. And I think part of the reason that hasn't happened is because in some ways China is diverging from the integration with the global economy according to those global rules. It's not the only reason. Let me say the turn against globalization more broadly, and of course war and other issues that detract from global economic growth have also made it harder for China to overcome the United States as the largest economy in the world. I don't see that as China's overriding goal. I see it as something that we look to because the possibility, of course, of this massive economy overtaking the United States is quite real. I don't find that threatening. I don't think many people do. I think that was more a characterization of this great global power should be, that given its size and strength, the largest economy in the world, unless there are impediments to that. And those impediments is, I think, what we're seeing there. And so that goal, I think the Chinese government is grappling with. And again, the goal is not overtaking the United States. The goal is China's healthy development. And so that China can be, rejuvenated as a national power, a global power. And I think that goal is going to be more challenging as China continues to have a difficult time with its economy at home. If China cannot continue to rely on trade-driven growth, it is going to have to, of course, rely on consumption-driven growth and China participating more in the global economy. That, again, requires a more stable environment. And so instead, I think the Chinese government's motivations, in addition to stable development, are on other goals. And that is China just being able to be seen as a more a better partner on the global stage to many different stakeholders. And I think China's made a lot of progress on that, maybe not with the United States, but with other parts of the world. And I think that's going to continue. And we've already seen it with President Xi's behavior since he first left China in advance of the Party Congress, but trying to really strengthen relationships, not just with the quote unquote global South, but with other parts of the world, where China's enhanced relationships would then reinforce China's continued healthy development. And I think that's where China is going to face some headwinds. I do think that. And I think the war in Russia does not help China in that way. And it doesn't help the global economy either. But I do want to, hasten to stress that I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is driven by overtaking the United States as the #1 economy in the world. They want a stable economic environment so that they can be a global power, not the global power.
I certainly hope you're right that this is a positive sum game still, that both economies can grow bigger rather than a zero sum of which one is slightly bigger than the other. But I want to turn next to a comment that you made in your presentation about competition for leadership on the global stage, right? And I think it might be fair to characterize the Biden administration as not only carrying forward some of the Trump administration's economic policies towards China, but globalizing it or multilateralizing it, right? Getting more allies to buy into this. We see a lot more conversations about reviewing of China policy in Germany and all over the world, right? UK, Japan. So do you think that what is going to result from this, right? Are countries going to have to pick a side, right? And see this fragmentation of the global economy? Is the US, is it in the interest of the US to push countries along in this direction? Or will it alienate allies like South Korea, for example, that feel very much aggrieved by the latest CHIPS Act? What is your take on this sort of the multilateralization of competition?
Well, what we hear from foreign countries in every part of the world is no one wants to choose between the US and China. And so the plea of don't make us choose seems to be a pretty consistent theme. And we can point to a couple of the important bilateral relationships that both China and the United States have with others to really underscore that point. And I can start with the German chancellor's travel to Beijing last week. Now, the US-German relationship is incredibly strong right now, obviously underpinned by the NATO alliance and the concerns over Russia's behavior in Ukraine. However, the chancellor felt it was very important that Germany continue to have a good relationship with China, and one that is mutually beneficial in the commercial sphere, a very important component of that bilateral relationship for Germany and for China. And so he traveled to China with a dozen CEOs in order to reinforce that point. Probably next week, if not this week, the German government is going to come out with their China strategy, which, like you referenced, really does underscore the competitive aspects of the German-Chinese relationship and the many areas of challenge and competition, which sound eerily familiar to us hearing that kind of rhetoric in the US-China relationship. So I would just underscore a lot of countries understand that the dynamic in their relationship with China is complicated, and it's complicated by relationships with the United States, and certainly not dictated by either Beijing or Washington, D.C. Each country has its own national interests that they're trying to protect here, and not allowing US-China competition to undermine domestic interests. I think Saudi Arabia is another very interesting example, a country with which the United States has had a very strong relationship, troubled certainly, but very strong. And China and Saudi have a very strong relationship as well. And so these are stakeholders that see common interest as well as challenges. And I think that South Korea, as you already mentioned, is very, very interested in working with the United States on a whole host of issues, and remains very interested in maintaining a positive relationship with China as well. I think, to me, the challenges that the global community faces in seeing US-China competition playing out in their midst is trying not to get caught up by it. And that is something that truly every country that I speak with says, we don't want to have to choose. We can't choose. we have to be able to have relationships with the two largest economies and two global powers simultaneously, even if we have stronger ties to one or the other, or shared interests with one and not the other. So I think we're going to continue to see that being a real theme of U.S.-China competition, that it's being navigated very carefully by every other stakeholder who's impacted by it.
Thank you. I want to weave in one of the audience questions that's related to this theme, which is, right, this very interesting question of what if, with this, if we're in a new Cold War, right, what are the blocks look like, right? If the US leads the developed world, you got 2/3 of the world economy, maybe less than 1/3 of the population. You get China leading the developing world with 2/3 of the world population, smaller economy. What is that? Would you say that is not, based on your previous comments, right, not the direction that either developing countries or developed countries want to go? Is there a chance of this block formation sort of happening? Is it democracy versus non-democracies? And finally, if I can weave in sort of another dimension, which is the Belt and Road, right, which seems to, fit into this theme, where is that fit into this formation of blocks, if you will? If countries had to choose a side, what would these blocks look like? And, is there a winner over the longer term?
The Biden administration certainly talks a lot about values-based competition, and has worked very effectively to build coalitions of like-minded partners on a number of issues, and the war in Ukraine is one of them. But it's not an easy rubric to use to define all diplomatic relations among countries. And I don't have to get very far down the road before I start talking about India. So, of course, India is a strong partner of the United States, and we created, under the last administration, strengthened in this administration, this Quad, this four country grouping to talk about regional and global security issues, and the countries, of course, being India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And they talk a lot, I'm sure, about China and about the war in Ukraine. At the same time that, of course, India has a very strong relationship with Russia. And so I can't really see values-based competition being easy for the world, because India is one example, but we can point to so many others. And so again, I think that countries are trying to be as sophisticated and as clear as possible that no, they're going to be members of IPEF, of the Indo-Pacific investment framework, as they're also trying to, economic framework, as they're also strengthening their relationships with China under RCEP. There are a number of security, economic, trade, and just dialogue groupings that include countries with different sets of allegiances and alliances. And I'll take it out of national government leaders and put it into the language that I use every day when I'm advising clients, and that is companies in all of these different countries. We too don't want to have to choose between the United States and China, because we have interests across the world. And so you can't simply say there's a values-based competition that's going to drive our company's behavior, our country's behavior, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine resulted in a large number of countries exiting the Russia market, condemning Russia's actions. I don't think that would happen as easily if the war were happening in a war and invasion were happening in another part of the world. And so it's these are very, very challenging issues, I think, for countries and companies. And I don't think that the values-based competition rubric, while I can understand and have a lot of sympathy for wanting to work more closely with countries with whom we share values, the world doesn't allow us the luxury of only interacting with that that kind of a grouping, because interests are much more complicated than solely just based on values.
Absolutely. As we're closing down on the time we have here, I'm going to weave together a couple of questions into a real tough one to end with, right? So, you know, in your remarks, you talked about managing competition and managing this rivalry. Here in you know, Greater Kansas City, we're familiar with rivalry in a way that is not destructive, right? The border war between KU and Mizzou is mutually beneficial, arguably. And as a diehard Duke basketball fan myself, you know, our rivalry with UNC is not one where we try to destroy each other, but one that is a sustained relationship over time. So is it possible for U.S.-China rivalry to look, how does it become more you know, less destructive? And if you were advising President Biden, right, on this, how to move the relationship in a more constructive direction, what would you, you know, what would you advise them on areas that are maybe particularly dangerous roads to go down, and areas where possible off-ramps exist? And finally, to weave in one other audience question, which is this idea that, you know, whether American politicians should be wary of, and public should be wary of confusing government actions, Chinese government actions, with Chinese ethnicity, and especially Chinese Americans, and how Chinese Americans such as myself might be caught up as this rivalry intensifies and deteriorates.
Let me just say something about that last topic, because it is such an important issue, that Americans not be racist in our policies towards anybody. But certainly a more competitive U.S.-China relationship in the world has nothing to do with people of Chinese ethnicity, whether they're Chinese nationals or they're Chinese Americans, Chinese Mexicans, whatever. And so that really should have no room in the United States, and is a real embarrassment to our nation. When people are targeted based on their ethnicity. That was one of the real tragedies that was unfolding over the past few years as the U.S.-China relationship became more contentious, was seeing the violence spiking against Chinese Americans or any ethnically Chinese person in the United States. And that's something I'm very proud that our government has wholeheartedly condemned. And I appreciated President Biden's leadership on that, because he needed to set the tone at the top, that is completely un-American, that kind of behavior. I will say, I think that the Biden administration is trying to find ways to manage a competitive relationship with China. Nobody that I see in the Biden administration working on China policy has this foregone conclusion that we must end in a war, and that it's only through a war that the United States will win. I don't see that. I see, as you mentioned earlier, Jack, the Biden administration saying that U.S.-China competition is not a bilateral issue. This is an issue of concern about the direction of China's growth, and wanting to make sure that American interests were protected as China continues to grow. It's not about keeping China down. It's not about undermining the possibility of China to continue to develop. It is, however, about making sure that the United States and American interests are not undermined in the process. And I think that one way that we must do more is reinforcing the areas of overlap between US and Chinese goals and the interests that we share. For example, the interests in trade. Trade doesn't really have a winner. Both China and the United States have benefited tremendously from our trade and investment relationship. Yes, there are national security issues that Washington and Beijing are concerned about in elements of trade and investment. But what we need to do is make sure we're reinforcing with our government officials. So if I were to be, as you asked, advising President Biden, I would reinforce again and again and again that trade in non-sensitive issue areas, investment in parts of the economy that don't have a national security overlay must continue. That interaction between China and the United States on academic research must continue. These areas of cooperation on fighting global health pandemics and climate change and keeping weapons of mass destruction out of the hands of rogue actors, that kind of cooperation must continue. And I do think that the Biden administration in the national security strategy laid that out, that while we have a more competitive relationship with China, we also have overlapping interests where we must engage. Now, I wouldn't overstate it, that cooperation is the hallmark of the U.S.-China relationship. It certainly is not currently and probably won't be for the foreseeable future. But American and Chinese policymakers have to get back, use those muscles of coordination again that we used in the past. And so I would continue to stress to President Biden that maybe we have to start with some low-hanging fruit, but we can. There are areas where, for example, making sure that Chinese invested companies on U.S. exchanges are audited, as is the rule for every company that's on U.S. exchanges. That coordination is happening with U.S. officials having been in Hong Kong. And I hope we can resolve that issue so that Chinese companies can remain on U.S. exchanges and we can reinforce how mutually beneficial that is. And also when we do coordinate with one another, how we can resolve issues that exist between us. Not every issue, but there are so many where we can do more, and Beijing needs to want that as well. And so we need to be telling President Biden and President Xi that needs to be a message that our diplomats and policymakers are saying to one another. Yes, we have many areas of disagreement, but we must find a way to collaborate in areas to reinforce for everyone around the world this sense that the US and China can coexist peacefully.
Thank you so much, Amy. You've given us so much to think about. Wonderful insights. I wish we had more time to continue this conversation, but we are sadly out of time, and I'll hand the mic back to our organizers of the IRC to close us out. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Jack and Amy, what a special way to end our 6-part Global Motivation series. Amy, thank you for all the insights that you shared, and Jack for your thoughtful questions. We hope that everyone has taken something away from this series and go back and watch the other installments to see what pieces you can take away with you. We do have a variety of other programs coming up at the IRC. We hope you'll check us out online at irckc.org. And thanks again to our coordinating partners today for this program, the U.S. Heartland China Association. Thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you very soon.